Ahoy there, YouTube! I'm back again for another Bowers News Corner, where I talk about something newsy and bring it into your eyes because I think it's interesting. And yesterday, I got a really weird ADHD thing that went on where I decided I wanted to take a picture, so to speak, of exactly what was happening in tabletop game crowdfunding yesterday, which was July 8th, 2024, probably around 11:30 a.m. I started on this endeavor. And essentially what I did was I went to the four quote-unquote main crowdfunding websites where you could do tabletop games, which used to be Indiegogo, which we'll talk about. It's kind of a joke now, but we'll talk a little bit about them. Then there's Backerkit, Gamefound, and the big Mama Jamma Kickstarter. So I looked at every single project that was live right now in tabletop games on all four of those websites, which amounted to 414 different projects. 267 of them, by the way, which are funded, which is amazing. That is 64%. 64% of the crowdfunding projects that are live right now are funded. Now, and trust me, I'm going to really break this up because they're not all games. It's not all board games. I really broke down into a couple different categories, which were board games, which, you know, and I also threw print and plays in there. I think next month I might break this up into two separate segments. RPGs, STLs, which are like 3D printable things, which you see all the time, and wowzers, there's so many of those. I could not believe how many of those were. Accessories, others, which we only had 9 of them. Those are kind of like, oh, I'm starting a gaming convention, or I'm starting a board game cafe, or I'm doing an app, various different stuff like that. And then cards, which I'll actually mock those people a little bit later, because there's actually a really popular section on Kickstarter that is devoted specifically to playing cards, which you should be putting your playing cards and not in tabletop games. But I'll wave my fist at them later. So those 414 projects currently, there's $12,364,850 that are invested into all those projects. But those are some of the big, interesting numbers. Now I really want to break them down, analyze it, and go bit by bit. So first we're going to start with Indiegogo just to kind of get it out of the way. Now right now there's actually 4 projects live, but when I started, there was only 2 projects live, one of which was like this really cool 3D puzzle, which was totally not a game, but I'm not going to take it from Indiegogo because they really need the win. The other project that was live was actually this 1950s lingerie playing card pinups by Cursed, which has raised $0 still in the next day. So essentially Indiegogo only had 2 projects, so we really can't cipher too much off those projects. So we're just going to skip forward. No real what we would call tabletop games projects there. So then we go to Backerkit, which if you're not familiar with Backerkit, Backerkit pretty much has 2 distinctive group of people, which is either big tentpole type games that do like big numbers, and we know they're going to do big numbers, like Gloomhaven, or the next game by like a really famous designer that only makes a couple games, or the most recent one was for Munchkin. You know, so they get some big tentpoles, but then, like they had yesterday, there was only 4 projects live grand total, 2 of which were RPGs and 2 of which were small card games. You know, pretty much. And they were not doing very much money. I think, yeah, on Backerkit, they had a grand total of $32,000, just grand total between them all, which was now, as you can see, ooh, Grim Wild, blowing it up though. Yeah, but 75% of them were funded, so 3 out of the 4 were funded. But once again, Backerkit's such a small sample size that I don't really think we can dig too much into it. Now, once we get to Gamefound, this is where things really get interesting. Because Gamefound has had this strategy right from the jump of, we're just going to siphon off these massive whales from Kickstarter. We can siphon off these massive whales, and we can keep these massive whales happy enough, then those massive whales are then going to go over to Gamefound, or they're more likely to see the small little minnows who they'll get the chum to. So that's the basic premise, and I don't really feel like it's working that well because, so there were 16 projects, and this Gamefound actually had a huge chunk of cash with $3.9 million of the entire $12 million pot that we talked about, which was everything in crowdfunding, on 16 projects. So pretty much there's the haves and the have-nots with them. And they had 15 tabletop games and then 1 RPG. And the big thing that I noticed about Gamefound was 9 out of 16 were funded, so 56% chance of succeeding, which is great. And then it was the haves and the have-nots. So pretty much all the... And this is actually kind of a concept that I'm going to talk a good deal about later. But the haves are, I would say, the games that do well enough where someone seriously says to themselves, wow, maybe I consider being a publisher. And I just put that number at $15,000. So if your campaign hits $15,000, I would say that you have that thought to yourself, well, like maybe instead of making a chunk of cash off the game in the back end, I decide to, instead of making, an 800 print run, do a 2,000 print run. And I don't make any money at all, but then I'm going to make a whole bunch of money when I sell these games. And now look at me, I'm a publisher. Like, that's what I think $15,000. And some people would argue, I think you could talk me into say 12,000 or 10,000, but that's the cutoff that I had. So, and we're going to talk more about that, especially when we get to Kickstarter and break down all the different stuff on Kickstarter. But on Gamefound, of the under 15,000 crowd, so the ones that have not hit 15,000, they had a substantially less chunk of the pie, as they had $51,000 of the $3.4 million. So, yeah, really small, teeny tiny of the pie, and and I will say you're going to see that in Kickstarter as well. But I feel like it was definitely a bit bigger, more pronounced in Gamefound, at least numbers wise. But the Gamefound projects that were doing well, were doing super well. 1.3, 496, 410, 565. We have huge numbers, $600,000, 458. So a huge jump up. But that's Gamefound. And I will say, I do also really love Gamefound. If you haven't been to Gamefound lately, they have been, there's some really cool stuff, some deep, like you can see rankings by funding, and you can see Castles and Burgundy made $68,000 last week, despite the fact it's not even active anymore. So cool stuff like that. But let's get to the one that I feel like most people are most definitely going to be interested in, which is Kickstarter. And tabletop games on Kickstarter is massive. How massive, you asked? Well, there are 400, excuse me, I misspoke a little bit earlier. There were 436 projects, grand total. I said there was 414. No, I meant there's actually 414 just on Kickstarter. So 414 on Kickstarter compared to 22 everywhere else. It's such an absurdly large number. Now, how did I decide who to include in my screenshot? Not my screenshot, yeah, my screenshot, my picture of crowdfunding for July 8th. Well, what I did was I went to Tabletop Games, Projects Unearthed, and then I sorted by end date. And it gives you the most recent, and then I scrolled down forever, quite literally forever, until I got to the part where it was launching soon. And then I started from the top, and I worked my way, and I clicked on every single one of these campaigns. And what I'm going to do next month, actually, is I'm going to just spot like 10 or 20 of the most unique and cool ones that I just randomly found. Because you totally find, you go through 414 Kickstarter campaigns, you see a couple that really stand out to you. But let's break it down from the lowest number of the category in tabletop games to the highest number. What I mean by that is, tabletop games is not just, once again, board games. It is games, RPGs, STL files, accessories, others, and cards. So let's talk about cards. I said there was only 2 people that launched on cards. They had a grand total of $4,000 they've raised, and both of them had failed. Because once again, why are you here? You're not supposed to be at tabletop games. Go to playing cards where there's tons of people interested in buying playing cards, because that's not here. That's just not our thing. All right, then we go to others. There was 9 total of the 414. 5 of them had funded, which is a nice 55%. They raised a grand total of $37,000. Not too much. We're going to look into those particular numbers just because it's such a small sample size. Now, once we get to accessories, that's where we really start to see a good chunk of cash happening, as accessories had 38 projects. 23 of them were funded, which is 60%. People want to buy projects on Kickstarter, and they've raised $1.2 million. And on average, the projects would raise $33,000 a piece, if you're just averaging it all out. And that's, there's a lot of money in accessories. Because here's one thing I'll say, this is going to be a huge jump, because the next category that we're going to talk about after accessories is STL files. I was blown away by how many freaking STL files there were. There was 111. 111 STL files. And let me tell you, next month, we're keeping track specifically of how many of those were scantily clad STL files. Because, look, we're on 2 right now. Where it's literally, just these are STL files of like, buxomness. And it's ridiculous. It's so ridiculous. But why I'm saying this, why I'm getting to the point here is, going back to accessories, they raised $1.2 million, despite the fact there are way more STL files, 111 on Kickstarter compared to 38 accessories. STL files only raised $438,916 grand total right now. So nearly 3 times more in accessories, despite the fact there's way less accessories. And on average, those STL file Kickstarters are only making $39.54. But if you're an STL maker, wow, now's the time to get on it, because I really feel like after looking at some of these, there's some of them just have the worst presentation. It's just like, oh, here's the STLs, give me money. And then some of them are like, hey, we're going to polish this up. We're really going to sell you. Like, they look at Kickstarter industry standards and they make a lot more money. And I think there's a lot of money to be made on those STL files right now. 82% of the STL file Kickstarters are funded. And one thing I'm going to do next month as well is I'm just going to infer if something's funded, because there were some times where it was like, oh, this is totally going to fund, but it's not yet. I was like, what do I do? And I started just saying, oh, no, it's not funded at the beginning. And then by the end, I was like, oh, no, we should just use our brains here and be like, this should obviously be funded, because I think that gives you a better... so, once again, I said 64% of all the tabletop games on Kickstarter are funded right now. And it also is 64% grand total amongst all of them. That number actually is probably higher if we just used our brain and said, like, you know, oh, this was clearly going to fund. Just something interesting I thought. So STL files, huge, massive. 2 left. The ones you probably already knew about. RPGs and games. RPGs had 113 projects, 80 of them which were successes. 70% RPG players showing up big, 70%. And they raised $1.3 million, which is only about 50,000 more than the accessories. Which you can say, you know, so you now know that board games is still a massive chunk here. And so those RPGs... on average, 11,635. Those ones were all over the board, though. There was a lot of small ones, a lot of big ones. But let's get to the games, because that's obviously the big one. So there was 141 tabletop games. Card games, board games, stuff that you'd post on Board Game Geek, that ilk of games. There was 141, and 67% of them were already funded. Now, this is, once again, remember, me looking at every single project. So the project that launched 2 days ago, the project that launched 2 hours ago that probably isn't funded yet, is not counted in here, but still 47% of all the projects were funded. That blew my mind. I thought it was going to be lower than that. And there was currently $4.9 million in all those projects on Kickstarter. Now, going back, I will say Gamefound playing really strong to their strengths, as long as they can keep these massive heavy hitters. They had 3.9 million to Kickstarter's 4.9 million. Now, we're just talking exclusively board games here. That's not lumping in the RPGs, the STLs, the accessories, the others, and the card people. But I still found that really interesting, that just talking tabletop games, nixing out the one RPG that was on Gamefound, we'll just throw that one out, they were only $1 million down. Now, granted, once you add the RPGs and the STL files and everything else, it jumps up to 2.5, $3 million bucks. But, you know, it's still really interesting to me just how much Gamefound is taken away from Kickstarter just on a regular basis. So I'm looking over here, seeing if there's any other interesting numbers that I could think of. And just the chunk of the pie, the grand total when it comes to money raised, 95% of it was between Kickstarter and Gamefound. 90, it might be more closer to 96. And then Backerkit. Well, it can grab a big chunk every once in a while with those big tent poles, but it's just, I'm so curious to see how this shakes out. Another thing that I noticed about Indiegogo is it looks like it's kind of embracing the fact that it's just like a pre-order service for like, oh, cool, weird stuff, which I think is smart for them, but they definitely look like we're not going to be seeing many more tabletop game projects on Indiegogo that are setting the industry ablaze. But that was the snapshot of all of tabletop game crowdfunding for July 8th, 2024. Let me know what you think about this segment. Any thoughts, feedback, input is appreciated, because once again, it's a super weird segment for a super niche group of people. But if you happen to be one of those niche, be sure to click on that subscribe button down below, as I do it daily, well, week daily. I've been really lax on it lately, though, in the summer. It's just hard to with all my kids home. But Kickstarter critique, where I take a deep dive analysis of a Kickstarter from top to bottom. And let me know, though, in the comments below what you want to see in this segment. And as always, thanks for your time, YouTube. Bye-bye.